you guys doing? As you can tell, I have a very complicated Greek name. So I often hear nectarine or economy. So if you guys can think of a way of mispronouncing my name, I'd be very interested to hear it. So I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time today to be here. The topic I'm going to talk about today is something I'm extremely passionate about, which is the intersection of technology and its impact on strategy and business, something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I want to start a little bit about my past. As I mentioned, I worked at this small startup called Google, you might have heard of. I had a business development role helping educate executives, obviously, on the huge changes that were happening and get them to spend more on Google's properties, which was obviously a very fun job. But one day I resigned. And the reason was I came in one morning and I saw this. A stack of 30 yellow pages were waiting for me one morning. This is a real picture that I took. So I was like, why did Yellow Pages send a bunch of yellow pages to the company responsible for killing Yellow Pages? I never really found out the reason why to this day. But this stack of paper ended up becoming a metaphor for me. This metaphor of people's inability to change and really stuck in their old ways and stuck in an old mental model. Which is why I decided to resign and start a strategy firm with a few friends where we help educate companies on how to navigate technology at a much deeper level than just simply buying Google clicks and buying advertising, but really thinking about it from a strategic perspective. And that's really what I want to talk about today is the impact strategy is having not just on the need to build websites and the need to have, let's say, a better IT infrastructure, but really how to think about it from a strategic perspective. So we see the rules of the games have changed, right? So we're going to give you a bit of a case study here. We're going to rewind the clock 10 years. You're the CEO of a Canadian company whose sales are skyrocketing. You're known in the press. There's articles coming out about you every single week. It's exactly 10 years ago. Anyone want to take a guess at which company I'm referring to? Canadian company. RIM, BlackBerry. Right? So BlackBerry was founded by Mr. Mike Lazaridis, and at the time was selling millions of telephones globally to celebrities, to the President of the United States. It was even nicknamed the Crackberry because it made people so addictive. I even remember a time I was at a bar and there was like a guy asking a girl for her PIN to message, right? You remember when it was like actually cool to have a BlackBerry? It was like the thing. Out of curiosity, who still has a BlackBerry? Anyone in the room? A few people. Okay, one person. It's from the government. The government is a bit slower typically, but right. So what happened exactly, right? So we're going to rewind that clock, right? So it's April 2007. The CEO of BlackBerry's at home. He's on his treadmill, and he sees on TV this announcement of this phone called the iPhone from Apple, right? So he's like, okay, well, maybe it's not such a big deal, just a new competitor entering the market. That summer, he opens up the iPhone, and what he sees kind of shocks him, right? The iPhone had 720 megabytes of memory. The BlackBerry at the time had 32. The iPhone had 2 processors versus 1 for a BlackBerry. The iPhone had a fully capable internet browser versus 1. If you remember the early days for people that had BlackBerries back then, the browser wasn't that good, right? If you tried to use an app on it. So Apple really changed the rules of the game. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the CEO back at that time, are things going that badly, right? If you look at revenues for BlackBerry, in 2007, there were $3 billion and growing quite rapidly, hitting a peak of 19 4 years later after the announcement of the iPhone, right? But then you could kind of see the rest of the story after 2011, right? So things are going really, really well, and today, obviously, BlackBerry is not the dominant company that it once was, right? So at that present moment, it's easy to criticize and say, oh, well, the CEO of BlackBerry didn't make the right call, but from a numbers perspective, things were going pretty well. right? So this is what's happening in the technology sector, is the speed of change happens all of a sudden, right? At first it's very, very slow, and then all of a sudden it has this dramatic impact, which really forces companies to think differently about how they approach their products, their customers. So there's this other classic line in business poetry that the world is moving faster, right? It's like change has never been faster. You hear this a lot in the press, and I don't believe it's completely true, right? I think the world moved very quickly. Let's say between 1950 and the year 2000, we went from not flying across the Atlantic to having electricity everywhere, so massive change. But what's happening today specifically is computing power is moving faster, right? This notion of exponential progress. And we see this with the computers that we have in our pockets, right? Anyone know what this picture is? It's the first IBM computer in 1956. It had 5 megabytes of memory, and it weighed a ton. So it gives you a bit of a sense as to how far we've progressed. Probably since I've started the talk, you've already received an email that has 5 megabytes of memory, right? So what exactly is happening, right? So are you guys familiar with Moore's Law? Who's familiar with Moore's Law, just out of curiosity? Okay, around half the room. So very quickly, Moore's Law, Mr. Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, famously predicted that the computing power will double every 18 months. And that trend is still holding true today for the most part. So what happens when you have an exponential curve is at first, you don't see a lot of progress. But over time, the progress becomes overwhelming, and our human brains aren't really that well equipped to understand an exponential curve. We understand 2 plus 2, but 2 times 2 is very, very hard to understand, right? So if you're in 1965, 10 years after, probably the computer hasn't reduced all that much. But today, 5 megabytes is literally dust in the air. It's almost nothing, right? So what we're seeing today is this explosion of computing power is going to start permeating beyond just computers entering the physical world. Decrease of cost of sensors, decrease in terms of computing power, the cost of computing power, but increase in terms of the ability to calculate, right? So we hear a lot about the talk of artificial intelligence, right? There's nothing that intelligent really about it. All it is just faster and faster computers that are able to improve upon themselves. It's not truly intelligent just yet. The prediction is that over time it might be, but we're really, really far away from that. But again, you don't really need to have something intelligent to be able to help, right? So you can think of, for instance, self-driving cars are going to be powered by algorithms that are just basically are able to predict what's coming around the corner. What's the impact really from an economic perspective, right? So this is a chart of the top companies by market cap. So in 2001, in the top 5 globally, there's one technology company, Microsoft. In 2006, still just one in the top 5. And 2011 was Apple. And then last year, the top 5 in the world are all technology companies. Right? So we went from the industrial economy really to today's knowledge economy, where the markets are rewarding information-based companies. I want to dissect this a little bit differently and look at it from the top 15, right? So top 15 in the year 2000, a little bit less than a quarter were technology companies, and the overall pie was 3.1 trillion if you just took the top 15. 15 years later, tech is much larger. It's grown to half, similar to the chart that I had before. And we're seeing that the total pie is 3.9. And just this year, technology companies are now over 2/3 of the top 15. But what's happened is that the pie has grown much, much bigger, right? At $6.5 trillion, right? So what's happening here? One, technology companies are able to be bigger than any other type of company in the past because of the connected economy, right? We all have smartphones. That creates billions of consumers on the planet. The second big reason is something called zero marginal cost, right? So if you look at, say, one of those big companies would be, let's say, it's a Facebook, for instance, right? So zero marginal cost, you can open up a new Facebook account. It costs almost nothing to the company. Well, literally nothing. It's just software. And you can open up a new advertiser account and start spending with no cost also incurred to Facebook, right? Very different, let's say, if you're Walmart, if you want to open up a new store, well, you need to dig and hire people and build a store. Facebook can generate new customers almost out of thin air, right? And this is really kind of bifurcated between big American technology companies and then big Chinese technology companies as well in this top 15. American companies typically global, Chinese companies in one country, but it ends up being almost as big as the planet with close to 2 billion consumers. And now we're seeing this trend really just accelerate. So we're just at the beginning. The whole ecosystem here, it has started to mature, right? I don't think any manager today or CEO is walking around saying, hey, this whole internet technology thing is not important. We're at the deployment phase now where everyone's connected. Now everyone's moving to a cloud-based infrastructure. And this is creating a completely new wave of innovation, entrepreneurship, and competition, right? So why the picture of the sharks here swimming is, if you're not a technology-focused company, if you don't have a deep focus, well, you're going to become fodder for companies that have that kind of perspective, that kind of capability. So we're really moving again from an old world economy to this new one, where cloud, mobile, AI, insert buzzword here, is really taking over. And I'm going to dive into how exactly. Obviously, I'm Greek, as you could tell, so I have to give one Greek mythology story. Has anyone heard of Pandora's box? So Pandora's box, first woman that was born, given this box, told not to open it, but when she does, all the evil of the world comes out and she's not able to put it back inside, right? So essentially, I like this as an analogy, is that we can't go back to this old world, this old way of doing things. We've basically moved on. Like personally, I'd like to live in a world without selfies, but it's a little bit too late. So we're kind of stuck with having selfies today. So we've really shifted in terms of how we approach strategy, how we approach company formation, and it's a very, very different type of mindset. I'll give you one example in terms of how the rules of distribution have changed, right? I don't know if you've heard of the term an economic moat. A moat exemplifies a competitive advantage, right? So the distance between you and your competitor. In the old world, having a good competitive advantage was really based on having strong distribution, right? Being able to control suppliers at that point of control. Today, it's really changed, and the locus of control comes about controlling demand. So having access to a consumer, right? So for instance, while let's say a Facebook dominates when it comes to media, is because they own the end user. Versus back in the day, if you had a newspaper, well, the point of control was shipping printed newspapers, right? So that's very, very different than when you go online and use is free, for instance, right? So anyone here still subscribe to like a printed newspaper, just out of curiosity? One fellow that supports independent journalism, thank you. Now, there's the whole societal impact of technology. I'm going to maybe put it in a box and not talk about too much. Obviously, I'm optimistic about technology. I'm talking about this stuff, but there is some impact sometimes, like journalism, for instance, and independent press, that kind of gets swept under the rug when we talk about these things. So again, going back to competitive advantage, very different as to how you approach building that competitive advantage. And for me, it really starts with customer experience. Why do we still use Google? Or why do we still use Uber? It's on the screen. Customer experience, right? It's simply a better experience when we use, let's say, a Google search than, let's say, a Bing search, right? There's just better results. When we use Uber, very different than the old school way of like going in the street and praying that a taxi happens to pass by. Now the taxi comes to you. So the focus of these technology companies is constantly to improve customer experience. In the last letter of Amazon to its shareholders, the president said a very interesting phrase. He said that consumers are divinely discontent, that their expectations keep increasing over time. And it's kind of true. We always get accustomed to novelty very quickly, right? And for instance, if I don't know if you remember the first time you took a flight that had Wi-Fi, what a transformative experience that was, right? So you're able to work, catch up on email, watch YouTube. Now, if you take a flight and there's no Wi-Fi, aren't you pissed? You're like, oh shit, I can't work. So we get accustomed to new things very, very quickly, right? And that's been Amazon's kind of secret, is this we'll continuously focus on lower prices, faster delivery, product assortment, right? So continuously improving the customer experience. This was slightly less important back in the day when distribution was kind of the key. Today, where customer experience is really the ultimate competitive advantage, this ends up becoming the huge focus for these technology companies. I'll give you an example of the impact this has on value chains. So again, looking at it from more of a practical business example, right? So if you're a TV network, you integrate content and production, and then you leave subscriptions and viewers up to the cable companies, right? So you can switch between Vibel, Videotron, whoever, but the TV network is integrating content and production. Now, Netflix comes along, and they integrate the subscribers and production originally, right? Now they've further integrated up the chain, creating their own content as well, right? So what ends up happening in the value chain is that they're closer to the consumer, right? They have a direct connection to the end user, right? Just out of curiosity, who here is not subscribed to cable? Is basically a cord cutter. Wow, okay, that's pretty crazy. Okay, well, I used to ask this question like 2 years ago and it'd be like 10%, and now it's like half the room. So why are we not subscribed anymore to cable, right? One big reason is you have to wait for the show that you want to watch. You get bombarded with messages that you don't want, that you don't watch. Another thing I always ask, I won't do today, is who here skips ads when they record? And like everyone skips the ads. And I always joke that, aren't you people ashamed skipping ads if people paid good money? But why would I wait for an ad that I didn't ask for, right? And that's this kind of key notion of focusing on the customer experience. It changes business models entirely, right? So Netflix doesn't care about advertising. They care about satisfying the user with strong quality content. And I'll say one quick anecdote about Netflix is, it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback and say, well, of course Netflix was always going to win. Just look at their model. Do you guys remember what their first business model was? They would ship DVDs, right? They would send DVDs by the mail. And it was a pretty successful business. And one day the CEO said, you know what, he saw the rise of broadband, the capability of being able to stream, and he took a very bold decision. At the weekly management meetings, he decided to remove the DVD team from the conversations at a point in time where that team generated 100% of the revenues and profits of the company, right? So imagine you have a company and everything's being paid for by this division, and you tell them, well, sorry guys, you can't come to the meetings anymore. Like, it takes a really bold step and strategic thinking to say, hey, I'm going to do this move, right? So it's easy to say, well, Netflix was always going to win, but in the heat of the moment, well, it's the actions that people take that count, right? Going back to the importance of strategy in decision making. So finally, what this means today is that really speed is also another aspect of competitive advantage, right? I'm sure you're all familiar a little bit with something called the network effect, right? So a network effect has different levels. The strongest level is when you have a digital product that has a touch point which is self-reinforcing, right? So for instance, every time you put in a keyword into a search engine, it helps improve the results in the future, right? So, and there's another variation of, let's say, being on a social network. If all your friends on a social network, the network effect makes that social network more attractive for you to be on, right? So having a touch point where you can self-reinforce and improve the product or service over time ends up becoming a huge competitive advantage for you, where people can't compete anymore. So that's one of the key focuses in terms of thinking about strategy. How can I create this feedback loop, this very virtuous feedback loop, to continuously improve a product or service? Again, if you don't have a digital touch point, well, what are the other signals that I can use to basically build up this flywheel, this feedback loop? So in this section, I want to talk about so we've seen the impact that technology's had on companies, but the way we think about organizing ourselves, the way that companies are built, still follows the mold of 100 years ago, right? So we haven't yet innovated enough when it comes to management structures. So some of the consequences of these I want to dive into. So quick question, who here in the morning wakes up and the first thing they do is check their phone? Just out of curiosity. It's a little sad, isn't it? Like, we've become completely dependent on these devices, and for good reason. They're work devices, but they also send these, strong signals of dopamine to our brains. When it comes to a work environment, well, it's not very beneficial for us to be checking our phone all day long and being constantly distracted, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about AI. What are deep learning and machine learning algorithms really good at? Repetitive automated work, right? So if you have to be able to have success in a career or an organization, you have to be able to focus on a deep problem and solve it, right? And the phones are distracting us from being able to do that. So that's, I think, one key aspect that we haven't yet figured out is how do we give time to people to really focus on deep work in an organization? The multitude of platforms that we have today are just continuing, right? So, for instance, we're talking about smartphones, we're talking about different devices at home, smart TVs, etc. But this is only going to continue, right? So we're going to have sensors permeating all of our equipment at home, our appliances at home. So we're tasked to, particularly in the technology field, to look at all these different platforms, right? So the question of prioritization ends up becoming much, much more important, right? So what do we decide to work on first? Because we won't be able to work on everything at the first time. Everyone sure would like to have like a mobile app, a great platform, etc. But you'll have to be able to prioritize which of these you work on first. The big technology companies are also very good at keeping us swiping, clicking, and liking, right? They hire some of the world's best psychologists to make sure that all the apps that we have on our phone, we continue using them, right? Because their business models are ones based on engagement. The other adage I like to say is that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So that's why these companies really like for you to keep using their products. So what this means from a work perspective is that we have to get better at differentiating what is good information versus just signal or noise. Noise on these platforms, right? So it's really good to be on social media because you get to learn stuff, but you also have to be able to turn it off and really try and focus on the right information. So when it comes to deciding on what strategy to deploy, you have to be a little bit more precise in terms of how you go about in getting that information versus just the deluge of information that you get every day. This notion of playing offense versus playing defense, right? So you get in the office, you sit down, and then you have like 20 emails to respond to, and then they just keep coming, right? So this for me is playing defense, right? You're not proactive in your work if you're constantly answering someone else's requests, right? So you have to be able to go on offense and do strategic work to be able to move the needle, right? Versus just responding to text, responding to emails all day long. So this is another aspect in work. As managers, you have to be able to think about how do I give my team the ability to play offense versus just reacting all day long, being in meetings all day long. Again, these things are not super well understood yet just because they're so new. And then finally, what we see is continuous change is the new norm, right? In IT, for instance, just this year, things like serverless or managed paths and DevOps teams are becoming much more important and really increasing in importance. And this is only going to continue, right? So we're not going back to Pandora's box. We're only in the first inning of this huge technology shift, right? So we have to be able to create a system and a method of working that adapts to this change. And that's really what I want to get to in this last section is what are these new tenets of strategy? And for me, they're really based on three key criteria. How do we plan the vision of the company? Where do we want to go as a firm? Second, how do we want to get there? So planning the road ahead. And then finally, how do we execute? So what is the execution plan for the organization? So the first one really is this notion of strategy, right? So we have to define where we want to go. So define the vision based on these new technologies. So for any company that wants to do, let's say, a business transformation, we'll have to define exactly where we want to go. And the first rule for me here is that the words we use to define this are extremely important. So one of my pet peeves is the word digital transformation. Even though I give talks on this, I find it such a terme galvaudé, this term that really doesn't signify much. If you ask 10 people in this room what it means, you'll get 10 different answers, I'm pretty sure. So you have to be a lot more precise in terms of defining where we want to go, right? So if you want to use, let's say, data science to get to where you want to go, what is it that is going to impact the business on? Right, so understanding the context and really defining it, right? So we want to use, let's say, data science to improve our retention rates and predict when customers are going to drop off by X%. So being much more precise versus saying, we're going to do an AI strategy this year, which is bound to failure because it's not clear, it's not precise. The other aspect of it is that the importance of any technology shift has to go to the corporate level. So at the board or at the management team level for it to have any chance of success. What I've seen in a lot of customers that we work with is like, the CEO is like, okay, yes, great, we need to do this, big data science project and like deploy our data, and then it goes 3 levels below to some other department and never gets heard about again. It ends up being a place where it dies, right? So it has to always bubble up at the higher level, right? And one person in particular is the hippo. The hippo is the highest paid person opinion. The person that signs the check has to understand what this means, right? So if they don't follow the path, they don't believe in it, there's a very high chance of failure. So if you're in a technology company, obviously it's easier because you're running a technology company. If you're in a more traditional industry, well, this person really has to buy in to any kind of significant change. So second tenet, planning, right? So how do we get the job done, right? So this notion of planning for me is important because you have to define where you want to go for you to have any chance of success. And the first point here is one I think is a bit kind of well known, right? So you need to have alignment, particularly around the management team. Everyone has to be rowing in the same direction. Where this becomes particularly acute is when it comes to any, let's say, deep technology project. Because you need to have a multidisciplinary team that's really working on it, right? From finance, marketing, IT, tech teams, they all have to be sitting in the same room and know where they're going for the project to have any kind of chance of success. Typically, different stakeholders will be involved in the process. So I know it's kind of a very classic point, but it's still one that I see not acted upon enough in companies. The second is this notion of agile, right? So who here is familiar of agile in software development terms? Just out of curiosity. Okay, the majority of the room, thank you. So something that we do in our firm, for instance, is that we use agile at the strategic planning level to help companies plan their strategy, but an agile method, right? Because the world, as we saw, is moving too quickly, you can't create a 3-year plan and then expect the plan to be exactly the same in 2.5 years. The world's just changing much too fast, right? So you need to take into account the market, which is competition, technology, and the customer, right? So if within 6 months you need to make a change to the plan, if you're using something called a waterfall, well, it's going to be very tough because everything's planned out. But if you're using agile, it's a lot easier mid-sprint to be able to adjust on the fly. And this really is something I think is important, not just at the software development level, but we're starting to see it permeate across different levels of the organization. And we tackle it at the strategic planning level, but a lot of companies are looking at it as well from a project management level perspective as well. And I think it makes sense. Just because the world's moving way too fast, you have to be able to adapt. So I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think this solves all the problems. But it's one that I highly recommend you experiment with and see what version of Agile works for you. And then finally, getting the job done, right? So now it's time to execute. What happens when we're in operational mode and we're executing? So one of the aspects here is that we have to communicate the plan across the entire organization. Going back to words matter, the words that we've chosen to define our vision need to be simple enough that everyone across the organization understands them. And then secondly, we have to be able to repeat this very often, right? So if you're working in a 500-person company, everyone across the entire organization should be able to tell you what the 3 priorities for the year are. And if they're too complex and there's too many buzzwords in there, chances are they're not going to remember. So that's why this notion of repetition for me, it doesn't spoil the prayer. It should be repeated very often. And the ninja hack here is that you also share the plan externally, get feedback from your customers or your suppliers, right? So you'll be able to create a feedback loop from a different angle, right? On your own strategic priorities, right? So what do your customers think of your product roadmap if you share it externally? So again, getting feedback not just internally, but also externally. Constant learning is this other aspect I think is quite important of how do we create training programs on all these new technologies to keep people up to date, right? I work in the field and I sometimes feel overwhelmed with all these different changes. So it's really the case that everyone has to have this constant training, constant learning in terms of their program. For me, it's something, understanding how customers are using their services, for instance, ends up becoming a huge aspect of this as well. So learning how different customers interact with a company's platforms ends up becoming a huge learning aspect as well. You know, what's the definition of culture, right? The best one I've heard is, you know, what the team say about the company when the bosses are not around, right? That's kind of real definition of culture, right? The boss is there, people tend to say nice things. So what are the different mechanisms when it comes to rewarding employees in a company, particularly when it comes to periods of change, periods of risk, right? We want to be able to implement this new transformation project, adding technology across different levels. One of the ways is rewarding the right behaviors, right? And this really starts for me with the CEO. If we want to do a business transformation project, a certain percentage of the CEO's compensation should be based on the success of this project. And that's one way to be able to enable change in cultural norms. Obviously very easy to put up on a PowerPoint slide, very difficult to do in a company, but I still think one that's important, particularly when it comes to compensation. And then finally, tolerating risk. Who here has heard about the Amazon Fire Phone? Just out of curiosity. Around 10% of the room, okay. Who here has heard of the Amazon Echo or the Google Home? Okay, close to 90% of the room. Okay, so the reason you haven't heard, most of you haven't heard of the Amazon Fire Phone is because it was a bit of a failure. So 2.5 years ago, their president, Jeff Bezos, came on stage, presented the Fire Phone. They had spent $400 million developing it, marketing it. And as kind of by the show of hands, you can guess, it didn't go too well, right? But what was Amazon doing? Amazon said, you know, we need to be close to our customer. Our strategy is to try and be as close to our customer as we can. They saw that Apple and Google were dominating when it came to the smartphone sector. Said, well, we need to create our own smartphone. But they got a huge slap in the face by virtue of the market not responding. And a big reason is obviously timing, right? They were too late to the market. But what did they do? They went back to the drawing board and said, okay, well, we can't win in smartphones. What else can we do? So they looked at the home, and that's where they came up with the idea of the Amazon Echo. And today, it's the #1 device with 80% market share. Again, going back to their strategic focus of how do we help increase our customers' experience, they ended up having this, obviously, this failure generate a huge new interesting area where right now they're the market leaders, right? So you would say, okay, well, $400 million is a lot of money. I don't have that. But it's a very small percentage of Amazon's overall revenue, right? So what percentage of your company's revenue can you take and say, listen, I'm willing to risk this amount and try and innovate and try and help us get to a next level, right? They didn't bet the farm on the company. They bet a very small amount, right? So what amount are you willing to bet and say, listen, we're going to take this amount, we're going to write it off, and if it generates a great product or service, it's going to be able to generate that 10 or on 100x return on its investment. And if we lose it, well, it's too bad. We would have learned something in the process. So a quick wrap up in terms of why I think in Canada in particular, we have this huge opportunity when it comes to technology. We're one of the most connected countries in terms of the number of people that are online. The joke here is because of winter. but it's actually because of access to broadband. Second, consumers' expectations are always increasing, right? So this, for me, becomes the new strategic imperative for any company. How do we continually satisfy that? And then finally, the access to tools, the open source nature of a lot of these AI platforms are always improving, right? So we have more and more access to do new innovative projects than we've ever had before. So I'll wrap up with a quick story. So the gentleman in this picture is Mr. Roger Bannister. So Mr. Bannister was the first person to run a mile under 4 minutes, right? So what was interesting at the time was scientists would say that it's impossible for man to run a mile under 4 minutes. It physically can't be done. And then one Sunday afternoon in Oxford, Roger Bannister did it in 3 minutes and 58 seconds. Anyone know what happened after that? Exactly. So, but thousands of people since, but in the next 2 years, 16 people did it, right? So what happened exactly that Sunday afternoon? Was there a breakthrough in shoe technology, right? All that happened was a person was able to say what we thought was impossible was possible, right? So in essence, what I want to conclude with is that a lot of times our mental models end up becoming fixed and say, well, this can't be done. But what we see today with technology is that a lot of the impossible ends up becoming possible, and it's simply just because of the way that we think and the mental models that we have. And with that, I'd like to thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions or we go straight to the next speaker. So if we have some time, I'd love to take questions.
Hello. Thank you, Nectar. That was bracing. I'm an attorney. I'm managing partner at a law firm. I find that my industry is particularly stuck in old ways. We use fax machines still. And so what would you recommend to industries such as mine and maybe other industries here that other people are part of that might have, like you'd mentioned the gentleman here with the BlackBerry and government, that for reasons I don't want to get into, might be a bit dinosaur-like?
Okay, very good question. So I happen to know the legal field a little bit just because one of our customers is in that sector. And yes, it's a very traditional sector. What we did, I'll give you the experience that we had with this law firm. It's a 200-person law firm. We did a strategic plan, and then we figured out this interesting area to innovate, where we're able to rapidly create incorporations, shareholder agreements online using a SaaS platform. But trying to change and incorporate it within the law firm ended up becoming too difficult, so we ended up creating a startup on the side. So the shareholders of the law firm decided to invest in this technology startup and did it on the side, right? And over time, we're hoping that there'll be synergies between both, right? So there's different corporate structures, I think, that can be evaluated, particularly when it comes to like radical new innovations. Like for instance, like I was saying, the conversational platform that we're working on. But there's other ways as well, right? There's smaller stuff that could be worked. Like simply, for instance, like in the law firm I worked at, everyone was asking for a printer in their office. Like all the lawyers. So like moving to the cloud, getting them on like, for instance, Google Drive or that kind of a setup. I think just giving them the tools is one of the simple ways. But I don't have a magic bullet, unfortunately. Thank you.
Hi, Nectar. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm in the animal science industry, specific to big data analytics and animal science, and I'm connected with a number of different companies here in Canada and over in Europe as well. One of the challenges we're facing is how to get smaller and take our technology, what we're using today, and become mobile. Develop a mobile app for daily use, for the regulation of medicines in animal populations throughout the world. Do you have any suggestions on how a company can move quickly to a mobile, or suggestions in that area? How with the best strategy to move quickly into a mobile?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So mobile Developing an mobile app today has become a little bit like a commodity, really. It's like hiring a plumber. No offense to plumbers, but developing a mobile app is really relatively simple. So it's really what I would start with. Instead of thinking about the development of it, I'd start with the product design, UX aspect of it. It's like, why would people use it? What should be in the actual application itself? And the cost of it, the cost of developing an app platform is not that onerous today. So that's really kind of what I would look at. It's almost like it's a no-brainer that it should move there, so I agree with you. And then I would look at several external firms to help you build it. There's quite a few just in Montreal that build mobile apps that don't cost a lot. That would typically choose a smaller one versus like a big agency, let's say. So I could recommend a few to you after if you want to. Sure. No more questions? Okay. Sure.
I too have had the pleasure of working with lawyers, and I often find one of the impediments of driving technology change is the regulations, and a lot of that, until recently in Canada, a lot of medical data couldn't be hosted outside. So what role can government play, or should government play, in helping put down those barriers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two folds to this, is putting down barriers for increased innovation, but also controlling, how should I say, being able to implement regulation to limit powers of large technology companies. We saw this particularly in the States, where existing regulation, particularly around monopolies, is very kind of, how should I say, diametrically opposed to what's happening today, right? So existing monopoly regulation in the US is very, let's say, consumer friendly, but all these companies focus on being consumer friendly. So how do you regulate against a company that says we're in it for the public good? So there has to be a different model. When it comes to pro-innovation regulation, I think a lot of it has to move around the notions of data and data ownership. Like you mentioned, right? So I think City of Montreal has done some good work there about like having an open data database. Because what's been shown time and again is that 1,000 people working on a problem is going to be better than 10 people working on a problem, right? So this notion of wisdom of the crowds is always going to be better than a smaller restrained group. So that's what I would hope the government looks at, is how do they create open databases for anyone to be able to work on and innovate within obviously a framework that makes sense with barriers. I think that's much better than like 10 people in Ottawa that are in a floor working on it. I don't think that's akin to real innovation.
Hi, Nectar. Well, that was a great presentation one more time. I believe everybody here can definitely agree on that one. Working in the financial industry, basically, we know that a couple of years earlier, one of the challenges in the financial industry was how to incorporate technology into what used to be a human, basically, activity. Nowadays, basically, it's going faster and faster, and regulations are trying to match actually how fast customers or clients are asking for the technology in their hands. Now, the question that I have for you is, knowing these past challenges, how do you foresee, I would say, the next 15, 20 years, for example, what would be the leading way of doing business in the future?
In a particular industry, in finance?
Absolutely, finance, absolutely.
In finance, okay,
absolutely.
Very good question. Finance, yeah, so that one I think is, there's this hype around, I'll start with the hype and then I'll start with my opinion. Like everyone's heard of blockchain. Everyone thinks that this is taking over. The hype around it today is like, I think the Rami showed the trough of disillusionment, and like the underlying technology is extremely interesting, but the hype today is completely overmatched, right? So I think what we'll see in finance, for me, I see kind of two big trends. Is one, decentralization. So people having ownership of their financial data, similar to like putting it on the blockchain, so having more control around their finances. And the second is the rise of particular niches around finance. So things Like we're seeing it like Wealth Simple, for instance. So where they're able to have like more specific kind of like financial recommendations. The bigger financial institutions end up being like large aircraft carriers, so they're slower to turn. And that's given rise to smaller, nimble players that are able to come up and kind of take over, right? So what we'll see also is smarter recommendations. So if you're in a company called Stripe, for instance, right? So what Stripe is just a piece of code that enables online e-commerce and enables payments. But what they're able to do, because of the connected nature of their platform, they're able to do preventative fraud. They're able to avoid fraud just based on all the signals, the millions of customers that are using their platform, right? So the companies that focus on having an online connection and use that kind of predictive algorithm, which is basically AI, are the ones that are going to have the most success.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. I wanted to know what would be your view about how could you inspire a whole company into changing or like seeing the importance of customer experience. Sometimes in IT, I find that the IT departments are more focused on just technology and not necessarily about the customer experience per se. So it's like I want to see how, like, let's say when you were mentioning about Netflix, that he changed lanes. How can that happen? Like, how can you make everybody go on board on that change? So
it's very simple. Foosball tables, just foosball tables for everyone. I joke, having worked at a big tech company with perks, it's actually not the perks that matter. Right? Like even though like free food and having a gym is kind of cool, I have to say, but I think today's day and age, it's really about the mission. It's what people care about is not the economic incentive. It's really about the why, right? Like why we're doing this, the benefit to customers. So I think being able to formulate the end goal of the mission and why we're doing this ends up becoming, I think, the most honorable and the best way to approach it. And typically today's generation of millennials care about more the why than anything else. And with like kind of low numbers of unemployment today, I think you have no choice. You have to focus on really the vision and the mission of the company more than anything else. Time for one more, or?
Okay, one last question.
Obviously, analytics is key. Qualitative analytics is more difficult to determine and to take something with that and have a conclusion with it. Is there any predictive analytics software that you can recommend or suggest by taking some data that can, because there's so much out there and and hard to there's so much that you kind of say to yourself, taking data and how do you transfer that qualitative data and making it into a
yeah, so it's a really broad question because thank you for it, because but it's a tough one to answer. I'll answer in general terms because what's happening today is the predictive side, and I think some of the speakers after are going to go into this a little bit more deeply. The predictive / machine learning aspect of it, there isn't one like master platform or like one ring to rule them all. What we're seeing is the development of a bunch of different niches, right? Particularly in Montreal, you're seeing a bunch of this rise of AI companies that are really, really cool and smart on specific niches, right? So you have one, let's say, there's a few that work, let's say, on conversational marketing, right? Or others that work on like supply chain optimization and predictive. So there isn't really one platform that does everything. Because again, it's so embryonic, it's so early days, there isn't really one overall platform, right? What I would say is that if you're looking to choose, depending on what you want to optimize, let's say your web analytics versus something completely different, like your CRM, you have to look at which platform has the best quality data. Because the ones, again, going back to who's going to win in the future, it's the platforms that have the best data, right? It's not the most, but it's also the quality of it, right? So being able to choose the one that is going to be able to bring the best predictions is really predicated on the quality of the data. Thank you.